There's war raging in Ukraine, a general feeling that a second US civil war is possible, given the divisiveness of US-American politics. Children being murdered in schools is just something we have to accept as a free society, according to 44% of Republicans in a June 5th CBS News poll. It's got to feel like deja vu to Claudia Castro Luna, a war refugee from El Salvador's civil war in the 1980s. The correspondences are eerie in her new book, Cipota Under the Moon, published by Tia Chucha Press. Claudia is a former Poet Laureate of the state of Washington, and Cipota Under the Moon is described, quote, as a testament to the men, women, and children who bet on life at all costs and now make their home in another language, in another place where they, by their presence, change every day. Claudia, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Paul. It's always a pleasure to speak with you.
My pleasure entirely and my honor. Cipota, tell us about that word.
Well, Cipota is a Salvadoran to the core word that means girl.
Cipota.
Cipota.
Mm-hmm. You don't find that in Cuba or Mexico or
no.
No, it's a Salvadoran thing.
Salvi. This is Salvi speak all the way.
Salvi speak.
Yeah.
Well, how does that Cipota? I don't even know that. I never knew that word before the book. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's in El Salvador, nobody says that it's a niña. Niña, I mean, we all know the word niña, but we say cipota or cipote. And I really wanted the title of the book to cue immediately to any Central American that this was a book about that region. Hondurans also use the word cipote and cipota. So it already positions the book in a, socio-historical and also a geographical space. And I really wanted that. So yeah, so Cipota means girl under the moon. Cipota bajo la luna is the name of a blog I started about, I don't know, eons ago. And I've written into it intermittently over the years. So the title of the book is essentially the title of the blog, but in English, because the blog's title is Cipota bajo la luna. Yeah. And it's such a great word. It's such a great word, cipota. It's such a good mouthfeel, and just, it's just a great word.
Yeah. This is a very personal book.
Yes, it is. Yeah. It's the most personal of my books, actually. Yeah.
Why now? Why now the time to dig into that?
That's an interesting question, Paul. I wrote the book largely during the pandemic, although many of those poems have been written over the years and never published. So we all had those moments during the pandemic where we had time in our hands, right? And I started looking at this unpublished work and realized that there was an arc there, and there was a book there. There were things missing for it to be a full collection. So I started writing into those missing spaces, and that's how the book came about. I mean, it was a lot of those poems were written, like I said, over the years, and just collecting in a drawer. That
was going to be my next questions. Some of the poems go back to 2009, their earliest publication. And the question I was going to ask was, how do you assemble a book? So you just told us it's, you see that these are poems, you have some time, and you fill in the gaps by writing. Is that a typical way that you would write a book?
No, but it makes me think, and I'm saying this because I know you're a fan of Denise Levertov. And the way Denise Levertov wrote, which was, if I remember correctly, reading from her, that she would write and edit and then just keep a pile of, when the poem was done, it went into a pile, and eventually there were enough poems there for a collection to come together. So that is not how I've written my other books at all. I think the other books have been more project driven. So I've had an idea and I've really written into that for a period of time. These poems are different. There's different styles. definitely different, just different expressions in these poems because they spread over such a long period of time. One of the poems toward the end of the book is the first poem that I ever published. I think that's the one you're referring to. Yeah, My Father's Garden is the first poem that I ever, one of my earliest efforts and the first one to be published. So, and it makes sense in the context of the book to have that poem there about, you know, again, about the war and my dad and my father's return to El Salvador, and he's got, my father's a huge gardening, and just how plants in the natural world have helped him, but also myself cope and deal, and to an extent transcend the, you know, the just the muck of the experience of living with war, you know.
Right. A very healing capacity, nature, obviously. And, you know, the background on writing that particular poem and publishing that may give us a sense of your evolution as a poet. Can you talk to that?
Yeah, that poem. So I started writing, seriously, I've been writing all my life. I think I never wanted to take it up seriously, but I always wrote poems. That was my default. When I wrote, if anything came out of me, it showed up as a poem. And there was a point, I was already a mom. I had two of my 3 kids already. And I realized I really needed to pursue this. So I started taking classes at a community college, at my local community college. So that poem was written in this community college classroom in Oakland. And, you know, I remember my husband reading this poem, I showed it to him and he said, he read it. And then he looked up, he said, "You wrote this?" And I said, "Yeah, I wrote it." You know, I mean, I don't know where it came from, but I did, I wrote it. But the professor, I remember him asking me, he's handing back poems to everybody and then talking to me on the side and saying, "Claudia, would you come to the open mic and read this poem at Laney College in Oakland?" I'd never heard of an open mic. I had no idea what it was. And then he explained to me, you know, we get together once a month. It's an open reading to the college community and to the city in general. Anybody could come. We do it in the auditorium. It's super fun. You should come. I'd love for you to read this poem. And I want you to submit it to this publication. And so I agreed to the submission. I hesitated on the reading because it just seemed terrifying to me to read in public. But I went, I showed up, I was there. And, you know, it was like Hugo House used to be, where you stand up on this stage and you cannot see anybody. Everything is so dark and you have a light on your face. And I was just, I don't even know how I got through reading that poem, but I did. I read the poem, and it was such an incredible experience, particularly to see it printed later in a magazine. And they threw a small publication party, and I was there again, and I read the poem, and just that this experience then could be shared in this fashion with others was, was really amazing. But that has been my trajectory. I took a lot of community college classes, and eventually I realized this is not going to go away, and I need a lot more than classes in the evening could give me. And so I gave up my job and went and did an MFA full-time.
Where?
At Mills College.
Right there in Oakland.
Right there in Oakland. Yeah. I was, by then I was a mom of 3, and I couldn't just travel, you know, to a different place to do an MFA. So I applied to 3 local MFAs and chose the one at Mills.
Fantastic. Rather than have you read that poem, people can find it in the book. I think it was page 108. I'd like to go to a couple of other poems closer to the beginning of the book. There are a couple of brutal poems, pages 24 and 25, the second of which is especially haunting. Would you care to read those?
Yeah. Yes, I can. Let's see. Yes, Paul, I'm glad you chose that poem, the one that you're calling haunting. yeah, a lot of these poems and a lot of the experiences, especially at the front of the book where it's narrating the war in El Salvador, of course, are based on true experiences of mine and my family. So I have lived through, the experiences that I narrate, and I focus a lot of the writing of this book on children's experiences of war. And of course, then here I am as an adult writing about the impacts of war decades after one experiences them. So this one on page, this would be page 24, is called "This is Not a Poem." Guerra doesn't go away when the bullets stop, when the grenades go silent, when helicopters' blades no longer kick up the dust of innocence or presidential lies. There is no periphery to guerra. I'll say a giant cloaca, propelling its stench on the ground, in the sky, underwater, subcutaneously, clouding dreams, clogging guts, silencing tongues. Guerra does not know of lazy Sunday mornings or afternoon coffee breaks. It knows fear and death. I highly don't recommend it. And the next poem on page 25, it's titled Dios Madre. Behind the counter, tending to a customer, he could see her skipping and laughing in the middle of the street, children playing under the midday sun. Soon she would come in for her almuerzo, then head back out to school. He bent his head to count out change. That is when it happened. That is when bullets ripped his world in defense of nothing that matters. In a split second, children, dogs, birds, the ghosts who live in trees, even the gunmen dispersed, but she did not. She'd fallen under the old almendra tree, and for a second, nothing glittered, nothing, not even the sun. He was too late to her side. She still warm to the touch, her long hair wet with her own blood. Bring a healer, he screamed, a priest, a doctor, a witch, hire a mountain, hire a god, hire two, he begged. Someone, please conjure a miracle. Sugarcane horizons trembled and the looming volcano stirred. Cupped in his hands, his 10-year-old daughter in her school uniform passed from smiling to hardened concrete. When she was under 9 days of prayers and safely underground, he fled north, shoeless like rain. Somewhere along the road, he cut his head off to scream less. He carried cabeza and grief under his arm for miles, then joined a crowded bus, crossed a river, sat on the roof of a wagon train, crawled across the desert, his head facing upwards, strapped to his back, better not to see her in every girl he came across. He now lives in a place where people see him as he is not, call him names not his own, illegal, they say, among other things. The man he was is no longer, but he's still a father, her father. Some days in the hustle to find food and shelter, a second passes and he doesn't think of her.
It may not be seen as a compliment, but I get a nauseous feeling when hearing you read that poem. I mean, I think of my little girl. I think about the same thing happening to me. So, the empathy is yours. It's your talent. One of your talents as a poet, and the touch of magical realism takes us out of this is an elegy. This is simply sentiment. It adds so much to the poem when you go into that moment of him cutting his head off and carrying it around. Can you tell us about the background of the poem and maybe how that surreal element comes into your work like that?
That's a really good question. You know, that's the true story. This is my father's town where he lives. The tree that I refer to is in front of his house. There were children playing on the street, and a gang fight broke out, and she was killed directly in front of my dad's house. I mean, you open the door and there's the tree, and there she was in the middle of the street. And her family owned a little pulperia, a little store, una tiendita, you know, in the corner. So the father, the way that the tiendita is set up, the counter of it faces directly my father's house. So the father was tending the store. It's all a true story. And how I came about it is that I went to visit my dad, and there was a photograph of a little girl in a frame, in a kind of a homemade frame. And then I went to my aunt's house, also in the same neighborhood, and there was the little frame with the girl. And this girl is not a relative. I never had seen her. So then I asked, who is that little girl who's in that frame? And then they told me the story. And my dad said that one of the first people who saw her was his wife, when, you know, because they heard the gunshots, and when they ran to the street and she opened the door, there was the girl. So that was just so, I mean, it's impactful in the poem, but just to hear them tell me this story and watch them break down, because they knew this little girl. She lived in the neighborhood, you know, kids play in the street, right? Still to this day, as I did as a kid. So, because as I said at the beginning, I really wanted to focus on the lasting damage to kids, and also to the way in which they are their suffering is really the kind of the unintended or maybe intended byproduct of these wars, right, and this violence. The poem also, and I make an effort, there's several poems in the book about fathers. So I write about fathers and their relationship to children, because I want to, I don't know, I think it's necessary to showcase different ways of parenting, you know, different ways that men could be fathers. I mean, this dad was heartbroken over the death of his child, and he in fact fled, as the poem says. It's true. He fled to the US. He could not imagine himself in this town without his kid. He was just so heartbroken from grief that he needed to be in a place where no one knew him, in order to be able to carry on with his day, with his life. And so there are Latino men who are caring and loving, you know, of their kids, right? I mean, for me, it's really, I really want to focus on other ways of portraying masculinity as a way of thinking about it, and, you know, just getting away from destructive stereotypes. The magical realism piece that you picked up on comes from reading the Popol Vuh. So I have read the Popol Vuh a few times, and I have different versions of it. And there's one moment in the Popol Vuh where the twins go down to the underworld and they defy death. But what happens in one of those moments is that these are two twins that descend to the underworld. One of them is decapitated, but the other one figures out that they could fool death by giving him a head made out of a pumpkin. And pumpkins, of course, are so central to the diet, right, of the Mayans: corn, beans, and squash. And so they defy death with this ruse, and they are able to go then back into the world, and the world then begins. Once they have done and achieved this, the world begins. And for me, I really, the father is going through hell. So the father is in an underworld, and he's traveling in the same way in which these twins travel. And it is my wish for him that he find himself in a different place, you know, in a different way, where he could still hold his grief and move on with his life. So that's the piece when it does enter into that moment where he cuts his head off, and just moves through hell, right? Moves through that horrible experience of the desert and the trains. And yeah, that's how that image comes about.
Is it the Dennis Tedlock translation?
Gosh, I have several. I think I don't know which one I was reading. I think I was reading an annotated version that my dad sent me from El Salvador. It's in Spanish, the one I have. So I have, I have them in different, in translations, and I also have it in different versions in the Spanish.
Fantastic.
Somebody asked me recently, what books would I not part with? And I thought, wow, that's a tough question. I don't like that question. But then I thought, I would not part with my different versions of the Popol Vuh.
Yeah, fantastic. The first poem that you read of those two is a prose poem, and there are a lot of prose poems in this book. What was the inspiration to start writing in that way?
Well, I've been writing prose poems for a long, long time. I didn't know about prose poems. I thought all poems were open verse or verse, right? Metered poems. When I got to Mills, I discovered that you could write prose poems. I read Baudelaire's poems, right? La Fleur du Mal, Las Flores del Mal, prose poems, and the Haibun, Basha's Haibun, also prose poems. And so I'm really drawn to them. I'm really drawn to them whenever the expression requires a form that can carry a story. And I like their propulsiveness, because we're reading across as we read a regular text. So then the eye can move really quickly and in a very natural way across these lines. That gives them, propels them forward, right? There's a movement embedded in the form that I really like. And so, this book is, has a lot of prose poems for sure.
Yeah, very effective too. When I read the poem on page 60, Monsignor Romero, I think of Archbishop Oscar Romero, and the Father Bill in the poem, I think, might be Father Bill Bixel, the activist Jesuit priest who served prison time for his nonviolent resistance against the School of the Americas, among other things. Father Bill Bixel, you're nodding your head.
Yes, because that is Father Bill. I mean, Father Bill was a priest in Berkeley Church, St. Joseph the Worker, and actually was a Jewish friend of mine who said, you should go check out, St. Joseph the Worker, because he played the trumpet there sometimes. And I thought, if this person who is Jewish is recommending this Catholic church, I'm gonna go check it out, So I went and I met Father Bill, and I then became not so much, well, yes, I did become a member of the congregation. My father was a Marxist growing up, so there was no first communion for me when I was little, but it's something I always wanted to do. And already as a mother, I only had my first kid. I went through the process of becoming Catholic. And Father Bill was the person who was, overseeing that. I mean, he was the main priest at that parish. There were others. And he was an incredible person. He was an incredible individual. When I walked into the church, the cross at the front of the altar was one that had been made in El Salvador in this particular style that's very Salvadoran, from northern El Salvador, from a town called La Palma. And it's just so recognizable. When I saw it, I thought, oh, I don't think my friend could read know that. He just knew Father Bill. But the fact that that was there in that church, and that was the cross that was, on the altar, really drew me to it. And I knew there was a strong connection there beyond words. I was meant to discover this place. And so when Father Bill died, I was really, really pregnant. I must have been like 8 months pregnant with my second child. And I could not stop crying. I just could not stop crying. They had a service at the Berkeley High School auditorium, which is a huge auditorium. Nancy Pelosi was there. Because she is a rep from San Francisco, and Father Bill was known in the whole Bay Area. So there were politicians, union leaders, regular people. I mean, it was just overwhelming. And I was sitting next to this woman, and I just wept. I wept for 2 days, And I turned around to this woman and I said, I'm sorry, I just don't know why I cannot stop crying. But I realized, as the poem says, that when Monsignor Romero died, I was in El Salvador. My family was in El Salvador. And there was really no room for grieving. There just wasn't, It was too scary. It was too disruptive. I mean, it was crazy. And so then Father Bill, who was so close to El Salvador, by the time when he died typing his homily. He had a heart attack and collapsed onto his typewriter with Monsignor Romero's sermons on the side of the typewriter. And so when he died, it was like this flood of sorrow, just this gate that just went open. And I was both, grieving Father Bill, but I was also grieving that I could not do all those decades earlier. So that's how that poem then comes about. Yeah.
I think it's the Dogon who believe that the energy that propels the dead to the next realm is the energy that we give off in grieving through tears and sobbing and that kind of thing.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't think there was a dry eye in that auditorium. There were hundreds of people there. And he was in an open casket, Father Bill, in a pine casket, a very simple, unvarnished pine casket. And the UFW had a guard that accompanied him all night. And he was in his leather jacket, because sometimes he was, in his garb. And sometimes when he was out there in the world, he wore this rebel's leather jacket. And Father Bill shows up in my altar for Day of the Dead every November. And some years he faces us in his, in his regalia. And some years he wears his, I have a photo of him in his leather jacket. So sometimes he's in his rebel leather jacket with his aviator sunglasses, So yeah.
Another prose poem, page 60. Would you care to read that now?
Sure. Yes, that is another prose poem. So this is titled Monsignor Romero. Today is Dia de los Muertos. I took the children to visit Father Bill. As usual, we shared chocolate and pan de muerto. We poured a lot of chocolate on his piece of bread, and the ground around his grave swallowed greedily. We could have poured a river. When Father Bill died, each tear like no other, a river. I cried for each sister and brother, for the ones who were children and for the ones who were grown. I cried for me. I cried for you. I cried for my children, for things they know nothing about. War leaves no time for grieving. My right to mourn came with Father Bill's fall. At first glance, the US and El Salvador have nothing in common. Then time revealed the violence of poverty, the violence of drugs, the violence of guns, and like Monsignor said, the violence of love.
Bill Bixel. I interviewed him and I told him, you Jesuits are always getting into trouble. And he said, not enough.
Well, you know, the story with Father Bill is he was going to baptize my oldest kid. And all three of them were baptized at St. Joseph the Worker in Berkeley. But he had been arrested so many times at School of the Americas that that he was made to serve time in prison, as old as he was. And he had to go for a few months to prison. And it just so happened that the baptism was slated to happen while he was away in prison. And so another wonderful priest at the parish ended up doing Amalia's baptism, officiating Amalia's baptism, but it was because he was in jail. And I could not believe that they would demand that he, you know, serve time as old as he was, and as, you know, already, you know, he was not in his prime when Father Bill served time, and he probably had done it before. I mean, I'm sure he probably had been in prison for the same reason before.
Oh, yes. And it, you know, it says something about a culture that would do something like that, would put a man like that in prison for more than a 24-hour, 48 period. It's the same kind of culture that would create a School of the Americas in the first place.
Absolutely.
And for those who don't know about it, Google that and see what your tax dollars have been going for, which is really horrible. Tell us about the use of Spanglish in the book. This is a new development, yeah, to include a lot of Spanish?
Yeah, you know, the publisher had remarked on that. He said these poems are, Spanish shows up so much that it's like, yeah, it's just part of the work. I mean, I think two things happened with these poems. Part of it, in some poems, I didn't even know when I crossed over to Spanish. I was writing and somehow there it was, you know. So to have changed them would have been a little betrayal of the poem itself, and so I left it like that. I also didn't want, I wanted both languages to exist on the same plane, so I didn't want any kind of translation or italicizing the Spanish. I wanted them to be side by side because that's how they showed up, right? So yeah, because that's how they live in me, you know, that's how they exist in myself. I mean, the poems are artifacts that come before language, right? They're forms that we give them form through language, but the poem is before any kind of word. So whether it's English or German or, I don't know, Mandarin that you end up putting on the page, that is the form of this.
Pre-anagogic, I think, is the term.
Oh, what is the term?
Pre-anagogic, I think.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Yeah.
I'd have to validate that. I was going to use as an example of the Spanglish a poem on page 89, another prose poem, Aguacatero, and not only English, Spanish, but Nahuatl as well, referenced in here. And you know, I have a poem with a reference to res dogs on the reservation, and I'm reminded of that when I read this poem, or when you read it, when I hear it. And I'd love it if you could read that poem.
Sure, sure. Aguacatero. Useful word, aguacatero, derived from the Nahuatl aguacuatl, migrating to aguacate in Spanish, arriving at avocado in English. The generous trees flourish everywhere in El Salvador, edging country roads, spilling their laden branches over adobe fences. In Caliche, aguacatero means street dogs, the official title being Chucho aguacatero. Chucho for dog, aguacatero meaning everywhere available, like the overripe fallen fruit they eat to stave off hunger. Aguacateros trot, starve, fuck, birth, and die on the streets, eyes preternaturally dialed to plea. Tengo hambre, I am hungry, would you feed me? Tengo sed, I am thirsty, would you quench my thirst? Estoy enfermo. I am sick. My stomach, my sockets, my soul ache. Would you cure me? I am itchy. Would you exterminate the ticks and fleas, gnawing my fur down to raw flesh? Aguacatero means of the horde. It signifies lowest common denominator, but aguacateros are also noble, resilient, clever. The word agua runs through them, blood runs through them, and fire, flame, and red, the desire to live and prosper. Aguacateros resemble their two-legged compatriots. Aguacatero means plentiful, like the avocado trees lining roads, roads ahead that await us all, roads we must choose from to survive.
Mamma mia, survival indeed, and your excavating this experience that you didn't really get a time to grieve when you were 14 has caused you health issues. You were talking yesterday on the Zoom Use Poems for Peace. You know, you left Salvador at age 14, coming to the country that aided and abetted the side that has the overwhelming number of civilian killings and human rights. That's according to the UN Truth Commission on El Salvador. Tell us about what writing a book like this allows you to accomplish in your own relationship with all of this. Writing about this at some cost to your current health.
Yes, true. True. But you know, Paul, I think I'm glad I persevered with the poems and putting them together because there isn't enough written about the experience of Salvadorans and why there's 4 million of us now in this country. All has to do with that which is in that book, with the war that the United States abated and essentially funded. I mean, I think that if the US had never been involved with the whole process, that war, there were two sides. 80% of people in El Salvador, professionals, university students, agreed that there needed to be radical changes to healthcare, to education, to land reform. It was a frustration that had, you know, that you could see the poverty. You could see the poverty on the streets and how it affected us all. I think it could have been resolved so much quicker and with far less death than it did had the US never gotten involved. Because what that did is that refocused the struggle, which was one for human rights, essentially, to one about the Cold War, because Reagan positioned and justified the aid by saying, you know, the Soviets are going to find fertile ground in Central America and the Caribbean, and we need to do everything possible not to have Soviet presence in our backyard, right? And the struggle was one for human rights. I mean, I was there. I could tell you, I had classmates that showed up with no shoes at school. My parents were both teachers, you know, struggling with things like healthcare. I mean, just basic human needs, right? And the horrible repression where people were being killed and jailed and murdered, and there were secret jails where people were disposed in ditches. This before the war officially became the war. And so all of those human rights violations were ignored in favor of this rhetorical, you know, it was a made up evidence to justify this rhetoric of the Cold War for the US. And so it spun everything out of control to the point that, to me, the people leaving El Salvador this day, right now, coming to the US are escaping the devastation that the war left. So for me, this war never ended. You know, my family was incredibly lucky to have been able to escape at the very early, in the early years of the war. And even having escaped as early and unscathed as we're still devastated. I'm still, like you said, you know, suffering the repercussions of the war in my body, right? and I mean, as I said yesterday, I've been hospitalized over writing these poems and working on other prose pieces about the war. So it's really, really important that people understand how this war came about and the implications of the United States. And it's important for us Salvadorans in the US to have some documentation of the war. And so that is really what drove me to write new poems. Like there's one poem titled Caravan at the beginning pages of the book, which is about precisely that, about how the bullets that were dislodged in 1982 are still finding their way to find, victims now, right? All these decades later. So that I think Hector Tovar has a statement in the back of the book that this is really is a documentation of this tragic history of El Salvador and Central America. And that was really what propelled me.
Has the war come home here?
I think so, yes. The war came here in many ways. I mean, when in the 1980s and early 90s, I remember being at a party in LA. I was a young person, and somebody said, there were soldiers there. There were people who fought the government side, right? And suddenly here we are finding ourselves on the same plane. That happened a lot. So in that sense, the war has come home. But, also understanding the definition of war, as I do in the middle part of the book, where I draw a parallel between the war that we live, those kids in Uvalde, that's a war. That's devastation that happens in a war situation, right? And, how many killings of the people up in Buffalo? Same thing. I mean, we escape war only to find another war, right? And I work in this book to show those parallels between, the war in El Salvador that my family escaped, and then the war that I find myself living here in the US, or at the time where those poems came from. I mean, I think that when I think about the Pacific Northwest, and I feel very much at home here, and part of that is that I live with less stress. I live with less triggers. Where I am right now, I'm surrounded by trees, and that is just, my body rests from all the ways in which it gets triggered back to those moments, that I describe in that book. Yeah.
Yeah. You've been out of the Poet Laureate position for over a year now. What do you think is the role of the poet in a materialistic society that doesn't value poets? I remember I put a flyer that I was playing with a jazz trio at the Ethiopian restaurant in the mailroom, and a neighbor who, you see him in the parking garage or on the elevator or something. He said, "Oh, I missed your gig." I said, "Well, I got another one coming up." And I had the book launch at C&P Coffee House. And he came and didn't say much and left at the break. And I said, "Hey, how'd you like it?" And he said, "Well, we thought you were a musician. We're going to hear you play. And when you started reading he didn't say when you started reading your awful poems, so we knew we were in more than we bargained for." But as this poet, poets are similar to what John Lennon said about women. I mean, they're like res dogs in this culture, right? Poets.
Mm-hmm.
What is the role of the poet in a materialistic society? You were Poet Laureate. Is that how it's supposed to be? Is the Poet Laureate positions that we have around this country doing anything for poetry, or is there a higher calling? Is there a higher role? I think the work that you're doing with this book, witnessing, is the highest calling of the poet. Poetry is news that stays news, as Rapound said. But tell us what you think about all that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it is important. For two things. I think that a good poem, as you know, for me, when I was traveling around the state, people always, "What is a poem? What's a poem?" I think that people don't people sometimes put too much pressure on poetry to solve all their ills. I think that that is an issue. I also think that poetry is the opposite, the complete opposite of the crappy news cycle that we're in. You know, I mean, in order to write a poem, you really have to consider and wait. You have to weigh each word. These are very considerate objects of writing, right? You don't write, if it's going to be a good poem and a solid poem, you have to think about it. You have to consider, not just say lies, you know, not just say and throw out things. So I think that it's important to have that to show a different way of engaging with language. And I think that poets and sharing poetry in spaces that are unexpected, which a laureate often has to do, is a way of having moments to consider that. So I think that's important. I think it's important for those spaces to resist and to continue existing, even when, as you said before, you know, we get very small audiences, right? I mean, sometimes, you know, I've been a laureate. I've had 4 people, you know, I remember Port Angeles, a downpour. I mean, a miracle that 4 people even showed up. And then again, there's other times when you have a lot more people come to a poetry reading, but both are equally necessary and important. And I mean, I think it's just really, it's necessary and important to be out there holding that space, because the moment we give up to show a different way of being with language and the imagination, we have lost. It would be like there'd be no flowers anymore in the world. You know, the Mayans and the indigenous people in Guatemala and El Salvador, poetry is floricanto, right? That is the translation into Spanish, flower and song. And flowers, when you read the Popol Vuh, flowers are the highest expression of divinity. I mean, they were revered flowers, you know? It's not just, I mean, it really, we love them, of course, but there's such a reverence toward blooms, right? And I think having a world without poetry would be the equivalent of not having flowers in the world, you know? And we would miss it tremendously if we were to disappear, those of us who write it, and our work, right? So, I mean, I say yes to poet laureates for holding that space.
I think of William Carlos Williams noting that he was cheered, or I forget the word he used, that there were in Asphodel, that greeny flower, that there were flowers in hell. I just love that notion.
Yeah.
We're about out of time. There were a few poems that I'd had written down on my notes that you might want to read. Clearest of Nights, page 106. The Way of Peace, page 86. May God Grant You a Good Day, page 91. A poem about a practice in El Salvador that gives us a little sense of the culture. Maybe closing with that one would be best.
Yeah, that's a beautiful poem, because that is again where my dad lives, where my entire family on the side of my dad has lived in the same neighborhood for generations. So when I think of El Salvador, I think of this neighborhood being described here. And there is a family in this neighborhood that has had a small relic of Jesus as a baby that was handed to them by, you know, during colonial times. It's a Spanish figurine, and it was given to them with the promise that they would keep their house open to any pilgrim that came to visit the baby Jesus, and this baby Jesus grants favors. And I'd never seen this baby Jesus. So this one time I'm in El Salvador visiting my family, and my cousin says, "Oh, I will take you. You've never seen this kid, this baby." And, you know, whatever, I go over, I want to learn everything, right? I mean, relearning. And of course, I see this it's indescribable how beautiful this baby Jesus is. And people talk about it waking up. I mean, there's a lot of lore around this and granting, wishes and so on. So that's what this story is about. And the poem is titled, May God Grant You a Good Day. Roosters crow no matter noon or dawn, call and respond back and forth across yards. Sometimes a dog answers. The bicyclist making his way up the road announces fresh bread with a red horn mounted on rusty handlebars. He navigates puddles and swerves by stones while his crater-sized wicker basket harbors rolls with oven heat nestled in their cottony hearts. These are the sounds of happiness. The guava tree brushes shadows onto the old adobe wall, and a pair of doves coo to each other. Cuckoo-cuckoo, cuckoo-cuckoo, velvet songs of nothing rushed. Around the corner, an ancient wooden santo, for generations held by the same family, dispenses miracles year-round. El Niño Chiquito, the enigma of his face framed by the worn luster of his silver crown, his infant body resigned to beaded satin and taffeta stitched by local women, their hands swollen from washing clothes, from washing corn with lime, from grinding grain into masa that will be tortillas by noon. In and out of needle, women darning life, the coming and going between. We love you, they tell the Virgin. We love you, they tell her son. We love you, they don't tell each other. They don't tell each other. Instead, they mean when they say, Buenos días, le de Dios.
Well, may God grant you a good life, Claudia Castro Luna. Delight to engage you here. Thank you for taking time out of your continuing to be a busy schedule post Poet Laureate. It's a real honor and privilege to have this intimate access to your thoughts and process. Thank you.
And thank you, Paul, for your close reading and just the astute way in which you paused at certain moments in this poem's wondering, okay, I want to see how this came about. I think that is the biggest joy a writer can have, is for somebody to actually take time and read closely and wonder in the way in which you have. So I thank you for your time and effort.
Vaya con Dios.
Que vaya con Dios. Hasta la próxima.
Sí.